A species is defined as a fertile group that can produce the same offspring that will also be fertile and continue the cycle of life. If this is possible, you must be the same species.
Hi, I'm Okoye Yakini Amos, and thank you for watching this documentary. Did you know that the term race is a misnomer and that the term was coined to implement a classification system based on physical characteristics such as skin color, eye color, hair texture, and other phenotypical features? A hierarchy, if you will. But what the proponents of this concept didn't realize is that there are so many people that look entirely different that it's impossible to define those populations to just a handful of groups. Did you also know that in 2003, the Human Genome Project concluded that 99.9% of all human beings are the same? Each and every one of us is a walking history book filled with different chapters written by the genetic codes that we inherited from our parents, which ultimately make us who we are. According to the Census Bureau, there are over 7 billion people in the world. But have you ever stopped to think about where we all come from? Our origins, our beginnings, our genesis, our roots, how we get our different hair texture, our eye color and skin color. So join me as I retrace the lineage of all humans using empirical science to show that there's no such thing as race, and no matter what ethnicity, nationality, color, or race you claim to be, we all come from the same descendants who migrated out of Africa thousands of years ago.
If you want to trace down the genes, you're going to eventually narrow down to Africa.
We stop seeing evolution as one line. It's a tree with many, many branches. We know that we all share a common ancestor that lived in Africa between 200 and 150,000 years before today.
Race is something that humans created. Genetically, we're all the same.
We all descend from one small population.
All humans have a single origin.
The word epistemology refers to how one acquires knowledge. With that being said, the great scholar Fred Kerlinger asserts that there are 4 ways in which people acquire knowledge or learning. Number 1, the method of intuition. Number 2, the method of tenacity. Number 3, the method of authority. And number 4, the method of science. Now, the method of intuition asserts that you have a preconceived assumption, belief, or answer about something based on nothing solid or concrete. For example, you may believe that there are other life forms that exist on other planets. You've never been to another planet and can't prove it, but you have this intuition, this belief that there's life on another planet. The method of tenacity asserts that some things that you've been taught or learned, whether right or wrong, you'll hold on to those beliefs tenaciously, like a dog holding onto a bone, and you'll reject those things that you believe aren't true if they don't line up with your thinking. For example, you may tenaciously believe that the Trojan War really happened, no matter how much evidence shows it's only a myth. Now, the majority of you watching this documentary have acquired knowledge or learning through Kerlinger's 3rd category, which is the method of authority. For example, what is your name? Let's say your name is Thomas. Then who told you your name is Thomas? An authoritative figure such as your mother or father, and then agreement comes into play. You hear everyone around you call you Thomas, so you say, my name must be Thomas. Another example, If I ask you what's the name of that bright yellow glowing object in the sky, your answer would be the sun. Well, who told you that's the sun? An authoritative figure, such as your teacher at school, and then agreement comes into play. You notice that everyone else around you calls it the sun, so you say that must be the sun. Well, the same thing applies to race. Who told you you're black? Who told you you're white? Who told you you're Asian? Who told you you're Hispanic? An authoritative figure, such as the dominant culture you live in, your parents, teachers, books, television, and then once again, agreement comes into play. You hear others refer to you as those names, so you say, I must be black, white, Asian, Hispanic, etc. Now, the last method of learning that Kierlinger referred to is the method of science, in particular, empirical science. Now, the word empirical means what can be validated or rejected due to observation or experiment. This method of science is anchored in objectivity and is unaffected by personal beliefs, perceptions, biases, or political correctness. Arguably, the greatest tenet of the method of science is that it significantly eliminates human error and conjecture. So in order to fully understand this documentary, you must first strip your mind of any intuitions, tenacious beliefs, or authoritative ways that you've been taught, and pay close attention to the scientific evidence that will be presented to you.
Every human on this planet has a common ancestral origin. It's not a coincidence, accident, or strange occurrence that we're here, but a testament to a complex system of genetic variants combined with DNA reproduction that has been continuously occurring for thousands of years. There are 7 continents that make up the entire world. North America, South America, Asia, Europe, Africa, Australia, and Antarctica. Together they combine to account for the 7 billion people who live on the earth. There are several theories that have evolved over the years to explain the origin of races. Some stem from biology, while others stem from biblical accounts. One theory in particular stems from the research of German anthropologist Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. Born in 1752, Blumenbach is considered to be the founder of physical and scientific anthropology. In his book entitled On the Natural Varieties of Mankind, Blumenbach contends that there are 5 different races from which all of humanity originates from. The Caucasians, which represent the white race. The Mongolians, which represent the yellow race. The Ethiopians, which represent the black race. The Americans, which represent the red race. And the Malays, which represent the brown race. Blumenbach's theory is commonly referred to as the polygenetic origin of mankind. That is, mankind began in multiple places at the same time. Science doesn't necessarily agree with Blumenbach's assertion.
When you talk about polygynous origin for anatomically modern humans, then the answer is no. You can't have like multiple ancestors giving rise to one thing. One of them has to be the ancestor, and then not all of them. There is only one lineage that eventually gave rise to anatomically modern Homo sapiens.
If Blumenbach's theory of polygenetic origin is correct, then we would have to find the oldest human fossil remains in those 5 places as he asserts. They would have to be dated to be the same age or older than the one found in Africa. Scientifically, this has not occurred. In other words, the grandchildren can't be older than the grandparents. Africa is the grandparent. The other 4 in Blumenbach's theory are the grandchildren.
We had competing models, competing hypotheses. In that case, I've just explained two, the multi-regional and the recent out-of-Africa models. And over the last 4 decades, almost everything that we've discovered supports the recent out-of-Africa model.
Still, a handful of scholars maintain that mankind did not originate in Africa, but in other areas of the world, most notably Australia. But once again, science doesn't necessarily agree.
The earliest occurrence of anatomically modern Homo sapiens in Australia is about 60,000 years ago, whereas anatomically modern Homo sapiens have been evolving in Africa as early as 200,000 years ago. We have the fossil evidence for that. If you go, for example, to somewhere in, say India or anywhere in the world, and you find convincingly anatomically modern Homo sapiens from 230,000 years ago, then you falsify that out of Africa hypothesis. You say, no, you're wrong, because I have anatomically modern Homo sapiens from X part of the world at 230,000 years ago. Then you can argue the other way around, that modern humans actually evolved somewhere else and came to Africa. But based on the fossil record that we have, the earliest record of anatomically modern Homo sapiens was found in Africa, particularly in Ethiopia, from 2 places, and then they diversify from there.
So we begin our journey here in Ethiopia, a country located in East Africa. Now you're probably asking yourselves, why start here in Ethiopia of all places? It's because empirical science has proven that humanity began here and that Africa is the birthplace to the first human beings to ever walk the face of this earth.
In 1948, archaeologists discovered the fossil remains of Proconsul africanus in Lake Victoria, Kenya. Proconsul africanus is estimated to be 22 million years old. In 1974, archaeologists discovered the fossil remains of Lucy in Hordor, Ethiopia. Lucy is estimated to be over 3 million years old. In 2010, American anthropologist Johannes Haile Selassie found fossil remains older than Lucy, also in Ethiopia. This discovery was called Kadanumu. Kadanumu is estimated to be over 3.5 million years old. Africa is also the location where the oldest fossil remains of Homo erectus were found. Homo erectus is estimated to be 1.8 million years old. And finally, Africa is the location where the oldest fossil remains of our species, Homo sapiens, were found. The fossils of Homo sapiens are estimated to be between 200 and 150,000 years old.
Now, in case you're wondering how archaeologists can determine the age of bones discovered, you'll find that their methodology is very rigorous and highly effective. It's called argon-argon dating.
Argon-argon dating is one of the dating methods which we call absolute dating method that we use to date fossils. When we date fossils that are millions of years old, we don't date the fossils themselves. What we date are the rocks that are above and below the fossils. And those rocks have to be volcanogenic, meaning they must have erupted from the magma because they have all the elements that we need for the dating purpose. Lucy and Kadanumu were dated in the same process of dating, meaning we sample rocks from above the fossils and also from below the fossils. So if you have like an age from the above of 3.69 and you have an age from below of 3.7, the fossils in between will have to be between 3.7 and 3.69. This is a simple law of superposition. Okay, what comes above is always younger than what's below it. If I put this paper first and put another paper on top of it, obviously I put that paper later than the paper below it. Okay, this is what's called law of superposition. This has been figured out since like the 16th century.
The geographical location of Ethiopia is very important due to its close proximity to the equator. This means that Ethiopia and surrounding regions have a subtropical climate. A subtropical climate is defined as regions that have extremely high heat, lasting throughout the majority of the year. Unlike most regions that experience 4 seasons, subtropical regions typically have 2 seasons, summer and winter, with the coldest month of winter averaging a mild 50 degrees, and the hottest months of summer oftentimes exceeding 100 degrees. So if science tells us that mankind was born in East Africa, what does science tell us about how mankind survived the intense heat of Africa? After all, there was no sunscreen during that time, no sunblock, or air conditioning. To ensure human survival against the brutal African heat, there was one very important element that nature equipped mankind with. That was melanin.
The etymology of the word melanin comes from the Greek word melanos, which means black. Melanin has played a very salient role in the genesis of mankind.
Melanin is basically the #1 skin defense system against the ultraviolet rays of the sun. It comes in 3 forms. You have what's called eumelanin, which is a dark brown to black pigment. And there is another form of melanin called pheomelanin, which is more prevalent in redheads and people with blonde hair. And so it gives the skin a more yellow or reddish appearance.
So people who have more melanin, who have darker skin, have more natural protection. And people with paler skin have less natural protection. They have less ability to make melanin.
We owe a great level of gratitude to melanin. Without melanin, mankind would have been severely scorched and burned, especially in the arid areas of Eastern Africa. In addition, without nature giving the indigenous people melanin, it would have just been a matter of time before skin cancer would have wiped out the population of the planet due to the intense sun and heat. In other words, you, nor I, or anyone else would be here on this planet.
The study of human genetics is simply amazing. Earlier in the documentary, we talked about how all humans' DNA can be traced back to a very small population that lived in Africa between 150 and 200,000 years ago. Considering that there are 7 billion people on the earth, it's mind-boggling to imagine how we're all genetically connected to the same small group. In this section, we're going to show you scientifically how geneticists were able to come to that conclusion. When you watch crime shows such as CSI Miami or Forensic Files, the crux of the shows involve connecting the dots scientifically by linking the people involved through DNA. The latter is the same process geneticists use to connect the dots to show the genetic tree from which we all come from. Those dots are the Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA.
DNA is a molecule, and it is a molecule that's inside of every one of our cells, and it includes all of the hereditary instructions for the traits that we express. So from a molecular standpoint, it's a phenomenal molecule because it has the ability to self-replicate. So if I'm making a sperm to pass on to a child, I am copying DNA that I inherited from my parents, who inherited it from their parents, all the way back to the beginning of time.
The human body is made of many parts that work together in an organized system. One of the most important systems in our body is DNA reproduction from generation to generation. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It contains the biological instructions that make each individual unique. Our DNA is wrapped in an egg-shaped structure called chromosomes. Each person has 23 pairs of chromosomes. Our chromosomes are found in the nucleus. Inside the nucleus resides 3 billion cells known as nucleotides, which are identified by the letters A, T, C, and G. The A stands for adenine, the T stands for thymine, the C stands for cytosine, and the G stands for guanine. These are the 4 building blocks that make up our DNA. Every male and female are connected to each other through an intricate gene pool of our DNA. For the female, it's referred to as mitochondrial DNA, and it's passed down from mother to her children. But only the daughter can pass the gene down to the next generation. For the male, it's referred to as the Y chromosome, and it's passed down from father to son. In the early days of studying human genetics, geneticists studied the 3 billion nucleotides to analyze how genes behaved over time, but found it to be difficult. As a result, they began to look at the mitochondria, which is found outside of the nucleus. Simply put, analyzing the mitochondrial DNA was more effective and less tedious in examining human relationships than analyzing the nucleotides. Geneticists soon began to take DNA samples from people all over the world, most notably from Africa, Asia, Europe, Australia, and New Guinea. Their results were conclusive. The mitochondrial DNA of all females comes from a woman who lived in Africa around 200,000 years ago. Equally as important as the mitochondrial DNA is the Y chromosome. Just as the mitochondrial DNA is transmitted through its female lineage, the Y chromosome DNA is transmitted through the male lineage. Geneticists were eager to analyze the Y chromosome to see if it would produce similar results as the mitochondrial DNA. Hence, geneticists began to collect DNA samples from men from all over the world. Once again, geneticists concluded that all men today can trace their Y chromosome lineage to a common male ancestor who lived in Africa thousands of years ago. The results of the studies were twofold. First, that Africans are the oldest group in the world. And second, that our species, Homo sapiens, originated on the continent of Africa and no place else.
Now clearly you can take a fossil from the Herto site in Ethiopia that is dated to 160 and compare it to us, and you wouldn't see a difference.
So there is a concordance between the genetic evidence and also the fossil evidence to indicate that anatomically modern humans originated in Africa. People in Africa versus people in Asia or in the Caucasians, genetically speaking, they're the same. But physically, they look different.
Science has proven that Africa has the oldest and most genetic variation in the world. One thing that stands out here is that you see so many people who look different. Television, books, movies, magazines, and other media outlets have all played a vital role in forming stereotypical images of Africans, such as coarse hair, jet black skin, wide noses, and thick lips. But once you travel here, in particular East Africa, you find out that's not the case. Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop is arguably one of the greatest anthropologists of all time. In his book entitled The African Origins of Civilization, Myth or Reality, Diop unveils what could be the missing link that gives us a clearer picture based on physical anthropology on how human phenotypes evolved. He says, and I quote,
"There are two well-defined black races. One has a black skin and woolly hair. The other also has black skin, often exceptionally black, with straight hair, aquiline nose, thin lips, and acute cheekbone angle. We find a prototype of this race in India." End quote.
So the question is, how can you have two different populations, both with jet black skin, but one having woolly or coarse hair, a wide nose and thick lips, and the other having straight hair, a thin nose and thin lips? And how can you have different populations such as in Asia, Europe, South America, and all over the world with different hair and facial features? The answer lies in genetic diversity.
Africans are very diverse. If I compare, say, the San to the Yoruba or something like that, they're not very similar to each other genetically. And in fact, at the level of genetic diversity, about the same level of genetic diversity as if I compared the San to a population like the Caritiana that live in South America.
The biggest mistake that any individual could make would be to assume that all Africans look the same. Genetic variance explains to us that the older the population, the more differences you will encounter.
When you look at the genetic variation today in anatomically modern Homo sapiens, there is more variation among Africans than there is among Eurasians or any other populations around the world. Now think about this. Why do we have more variation among Africans than we have among Eurasians? What that means is the gene flow has been going on for much longer time in Africa than it did in the other parts of the world.
Indeed, Africa does have the largest amount of genetic diversity in the world. You'll never find a place in the world where people are so different genetically. So why is that, and what does it mean? DNA is the molecule that actually forms our genes. Each of us have inherited 50% of our genes from our mother and 50% of our genes from our father. But sometimes the genes that we receive from our parents aren't copied correctly by us, thus causing the gene to change. This is what's known as a mutation. Now, mutations are not a bad thing. Actually, they're a good thing, because without them, all humans would look the same. Mutations occur in each generation. Simply put, the more mutations that occur over time, the more genetic diversity will occur. For example, the origins of our species have been traced back to Africa roughly 200,000 years ago. Now, if a generation is 20 years, then that's 10,000 generations of genes mutating. This explains why Africans look so different, because so much time has accumulated to form changes in their genes. On the flip side, the younger the population, the less genetic diversity occurs. In other words, there are less mutations that have occurred over time. For example, it's estimated that the population of Europe evolved around 30,000 years ago. Now, once again, if a generation is 20 years, that's only 1,500 generations. That means that the population will have less genetic diversity, causing it to look more the same. The following section will discuss how genes in a population behave over time by focusing on genetic diversity, genetic variance, founder groups, and genetic isolation, to explain how these diverse Africans migrated out of Africa and populated the entire world.
Genetic variance refers to the differences in gene frequency in individuals. In other words, when you think of genetic variance, think about the genes that are inside of us that produce the unique features you see in different populations, such as Asians, Europeans, and Africans. We have genes that define our hair color and hair texture. Genes that define the shape of our eyes. Genes that define the thickness of our lips. Genes that define the shape of our nose. And genes that define our height. The driving force that causes our genetic variants are referred to as genetic mutations. During reproduction, when the male sperm fertilizes the female egg, an offspring is formed. While the offspring is forming inside the female, it's copying the 3 billion nucleotides it's receiving from its father and mother. But while the copying process is ongoing, a small copying error is occurring every 1,000 nucleotides. As a result, the copying process is almost perfect. 99.9% to be exact. The 0.1% of the genes that weren't copied correctly is called a mutation, which means a change in the DNA sequence. These mutations occur every generation. Although these mutations may seem small, when multiplied by thousands of generations, we begin to see unique genetic lineages developing as a result.
When thinking of mutations, there are two things you should remember. First, the definition of mutations, which is random changes in a DNA sequence. Now, the word random means occurring by chance or occurring without definite aim or purpose. There's no scientific explanation to what causes our genes to mutate. The second thing to remember is that mutations are a permanent change in our DNA. You can't change the genes you've inherited from your parents, and you can't control how your genes will be passed down to your offspring. For example, as mentioned earlier, all humans have 3 billion nucleotides residing in us that we've copied from our parents. Now, if I program this copying machine to make 3 billion copies of this paper, all of the copies won't come out like the original. Some are going to have mutations or changes in them. For example, some copies may have a short mark on them, while others may have a long mark on them, while others may be lighter due to ink malfunctions. Now remember, this mutation from the original copy is permanent. So now if I take those copies that have a short mark on them, such as this one, and make 3 billion copies of it, those copies are going to have the short mark on them, along with any other mutations or changes that will happen along the copying process. This explains why you see people who live around Asia where their eyes appear to be smaller. Actually, their eyes aren't smaller than anyone else's, but a mutation occurred in their DNA sequence thousands of years ago where they developed what's known as an epicanthal fold, which is the skin fold of the upper eyelid covering the inner corner of the eye. Now remember, the mutations are permanent, so they mated and created offspring with epicanthal folds as well. We'll discuss this later in the documentary in what's called founder groups and genetic isolation. Again, no matter what we look like on the outside, we're 99.9% the same on the inside. Think of it this way. If you ask me if I have change for a $100 bill, and I say not exactly, but I have $99.90, your response would probably be, that's fine, I'm only missing a dime. Well, that dime, that 0.1%, is the difference between all humans, which is caused by the mutation process that was just covered in this section.
From our ancestors living in a small population in Africa around 200,000 years ago, to over 7 billion people on the earth today, mutations have played a major role in the evolution of our species. From these mutations comes genetic variance.
There was like one group that left Africa, and they weren't big enough to take all, that group wasn't big enough to contain all of the variation that was in Africa. But all of the people outside of Africa are descendants of that one group. So that group had a subset, and all of their descendants have that subset and nothing more, maybe less, but nothing more than that subset that the first group that left carried.
When geneticists study your DNA, They're actually studying the history of your genes and the history of the people who gave you your genes. Commonly used terms such as genetic variance, genetic diversity, and mutations can oftentimes get confusing. So let's look at this example using alphabets to help you understand how this works. In our alphabet, there are 26 letters ranging from A to Z. Now imagine all of the letters are in the continent of Africa and no place else. Now, the same way each letter is different is the same way people within the population were different due to the mutations or changes in their genes over so many generations and generations of humans reproducing. Once again, this is known as genetic variance, variety or differences within our genes. Genetic variance is what makes us look different because we have different genes coded for different parts of us, such as our hair texture, our nose size, the size of our eyes, our height, etc. Now, once again, all of the 26 letters represent the diverse populations and genetic variants that were in Africa at the same time before our ancestors moved out. Now, when our ancestors started to move out of Africa, the entire population didn't move out. Only a small subset of the population moved, which carried with them their genetic variants to their new location, as Dr. Long mentioned. For example, the population that migrated to Australia took with them their genetic variants that are represented by the letters A, D, G, L, O, and Z. The population that migrated to Eurasia took with them a subset of the genetic variants from the group who moved to Australia, which are represented by the letters D, G, and Z. Now, the correlation is that they all share a genetic link to their ancestors who lived in Africa. Once again, this is why geneticists say that Africa has the oldest genetic variants in the world because of the gene flow. The mutations that occur in every generation has been going on longer there than any other place in the world. In contrast, younger populations, such as the European population, has less genetic variants due to less time the mutations of genes have been occurring. This is how geneticists can trace all humans back to Africa by analyzing our genes and finding a common marker in us that will eventually lead back to the first population in Africa. Now, let's look at their incredible journey out of Africa.
Modern humans originated in Africa, and they left Africa for the first time probably after 200,000 years ago.
So these populations of Homo sapiens that came from Africa at some point started to radiate, and then they moved across towards the southeastern part of Asia, across the Indian Ocean, so through probably Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and all into that southeastern Asia part.
To gain a better understanding about the migration of our ancestors from Africa to the Far East, I came here to India to retrace their footsteps. Now, India has a population of 1.2 billion people. In fact, 1 in every 6 people in the world reside right here. That's almost 20% of the world's population living in this one country alone. What's so significant about the people who live here in India is that they are a mirror reflection of exactly how anthropologist Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop described the second African to be, with straight hair, thin noses, and thin lips. What also is so significant about the people who live here is their extremely dark skin. Science, biology, and genetics all concur that people with light skin cannot create people with dark skin. With that theory being rejected, it gives us a clearer understanding of why these people's skin is so dark. It's because they are the descendants of the original people who made the first migration out of Africa. It also strongly suggests that the ancestors of these people with straight black hair, thin noses, thin lips, and extremely dark skin are the progenitors of the first people to settle in Europe.
Humans have lived in Africa far longer than anywhere else in the world. In fact, science tells us that around 150,000 years ago, all humans lived on the continent of Africa and no place else. When modern humans first migrated out of Africa thousands of years ago, They did so in small groups. These small groups were a subset of the African population because only part of the African population migrated out of Africa. Only part of Africa's small mutations that make up our genetic variants, such as different hair textures and different facial features, moved with them to the new regions that they migrated to. This is what's known as a founder group.
I had one founder group leave Africa and form the Eurasian population. And then the founder group that formed the Americas left Eurasia to form the Americas. So they had a subset of what was in Eurasia, which was a subset of what was in Africa. One of my graduate students and I have been combing these large genomic databases that have hundreds of thousands of markers in them. And I think we're working on one set that has something like almost 1 million markers on different populations around the world. And we ask the question, well, can we find some marker that is common in Europeans and not seen in people, Asians or Africans or things like that? We couldn't find one.
As founder groups such as this one migrated to new uninhabited places, they began to produce offspring. As a result, their features were passed down through their genes to their children. Those children continued the cycle by growing up and producing their own children. With these populations with similar features continuing to produce offspring in different areas of the world for thousands of years explains why so many people around the world look similar that live in the same regions. This is what's known as genetic isolation.
Genetic isolation is when you have small groups of people, such as the first populations to migrate out of Africa thousands of years ago and settle in foreign lands, and to reproduce offspring without any admixture from outside population.
They would inhabit a new region, and they would be isolated from the group that they came from. And we had a series of these, a succession of them, that populated people throughout the world. And eventually, you would get a population that had more the characteristics of the first ones that had that sort of trait.
There are still groups in Melanesia that look more African than they look Asian, because they just stayed there.
For example, genetic isolation explains why there's such a high concentration of people with extremely dark skin and straight hair in eastern countries such as India, Pakistan, and Ethiopia. Genetic isolation also explains why there's such a huge population of people with epicanthal folds, causing their eyes to look smaller, living in and around Asia. Genetic isolation is the reason why there's a high concentration of people with blonde hair and blue eyes in Scandinavian countries such as Sweden, Norway, and Finland. These populations that would have normally remained isolated began to move to new regions and mix with the indigenous population and reproduce offspring. This mixing phenomenon produced the different phenotypes you see in humans today.
So in essence, when you see different phenotypical traits in people, it's not difficult to comprehend if you understand genetic variation and genetic isolation.
My ancestors obviously at some point lost most of their melanin or skin pigment.
But how did this population lose its melanin is the looming question. Some scholars attribute this phenomenon to the Ice Age theory. A theory that suggests that when the Ice Age occurred, natural selection began to kick in, which caused the human body to adapt to the colder environment by drastically reducing the production of melanin, which is advantageous to warmer environments. As a result of adapting to the colder climate, melanin was not needed as much, resulting in their skin turning lighter. Still, other scholars contend that the evolution of skin color resulted from the geographical locations and climate conditions from which populations originated from. That is, the color of our skin, whether light or dark, is a direct result from humans' proximity to the equator. In other words, the closer to the equator humans lived caused the body to produce more melanin, which resulted in darker skin to compensate for the hotter environment. In contrast, the further away from the equator humans lived caused the body to produce less melanin, which resulted in lighter skin to compensate for the colder environments. But once again, science doesn't necessarily agree.
A significant part of science deals with observation and logic. In other words, logic and science cannot contradict each other, they have to line up. When carefully analyzing the hypothesis that skin color evolved as a result of humans moving to subtropical climates closer to the equator or to colder environments away from the equator doesn't add up logically or scientifically. Humans today share the same biological characteristics as our Homo sapien ancestors. For example, our ancestors had vital organs such as lungs, kidneys, and hearts. We have lungs, kidneys, and hearts. They were bipedal, we're bipedal. We're the same species. They reproduced sexually and had fertile offspring. We reproduce sexually and have fertile offspring. So what did our ancestors possess internally to make their skin color darker or lighter depending on their proximity to the equator and exposure to UV light that we don't have? So what's the name of the process in which human skin color miraculously changed? What part of the body triggered that to happen? What's the scientific explanation to the process? Where is the collection of data to analyze? Where is the evidence to support these assertions? Did our ancestors have some magical cutoff switch that interacted with the sun that said, my skin is yellow, stop turning darker? Then others had a magical cutoff switch that said, my skin is light brown, stop turning darker. Then others had a magical cutoff switch that said, my skin is dark brown, stop turning darker. If their hypothesis is true, then everyone who lives along the equator should have the same colored skin. So why is it that all the populations who live along the equator don't have the same skin color? In other words, why did this phenomenon that supposedly happened 15 to 30,000 years ago not occurring today? If your answer is lack of vitamin D, then why don't we see malnutrition kids who are vitamin D deficient in third world countries skin turning lighter? Or why don't we see dark-skinned people living in areas such as England where the sun's UV rays are short, skin turning lighter? On the other hand, why don't we see people with extremely light skin who live in places such as South Africa where the sun's UV rays are harsher, skin turning darker, and producing darker offspring? Again, where is the collection of data to analyze? Where is the evidence to support these assertions? And lastly, if the evolution of skin color is a result of living in warmer or colder climates, then how do you explain people with blonde hair and blue eyes? How do you explain people with red hair? Characteristics which clearly point to recessive genes. Did the sun or lack of it change that as well? Once again, from a logical standpoint, it doesn't make sense, and from a scientific standpoint, it seems to be based purely on conjecture. So what does make sense, you ask? If various skin colors aren't caused by exposure or lack of exposure to the sun, then what gives us different variations of skin color? More importantly, what does science say about the matter? Again, it all surrounds around the word we mentioned earlier, which is mutations, random changes in a DNA sequence. Science, along with genetics and biology, point to a skin pigmentation disorder caused by DNA mutations known as albinism as the centrifugal force of the evolution of skin color. In particular, oculocutaneous type 1 albinism and oculocutaneous type 2 albinism.
Albinism is a group of genetic disorders that are associated with lack of pigment in the skin, hair, and eyes. Albinos have the same number of pigment-producing cells as everyone else. They just lack the ability to produce or distribute the pigment in their body.
Albinism isn't limited to only humans. A huge population of the animal kingdom can create an offspring with albinism as well. For example, this alligator with naturally dark pigmentation can create this alligator with albinism. This tiger with naturally dark pigmentation can create this tiger with albinism. Likewise, this horse with naturally dark pigmentation can create this horse with albinism. Even snakes, squirrels, and deer can create offspring with albinism. This genetic mutation has been occurring in humans for thousands of years.
It's a genetic mutation. Usually it's inherited, and so it's autosomal recessive, meaning that you have to have 2 mutated genes for it to appear on your skin. If you just have 1 mutated gene, you're a carrier, but you'll still have normally colored skin because you still have enough active enzyme where you're making the pigment. And so you can have 2 parents who are carriers, so each of them has 1 normal and 1 mutated gene, and then their child can have albinism.
Indeed, just as people who look differently are caused by genetic mutations, albinism is caused by a series of genes mutating within the body. The aftermath of the mutation process takes place beneath our skin in a group of specialized cells known as melanocytes.
Melanocytes kind of sit at the bottom, one of the bottom layers of what's called the epidermis, the first layer of the skin. What they do is they make melanin, and they send that melanin throughout all the skin cells. All races and all colors of people on Earth have the same relative number of melanocytes. Those are the amounts of pigment-producing cells in the skin. Everyone has the same amount. Now, Caucasians or lighter-skinned people have less production in their melanocytes of pigment. So that manifests as their lighter skin tones. Darker skin patients make more melanin, and so their melanocytes are pumping out more pigment, which manifests as a darker color. And so what happens in albinism is that you have the melanocyte, you have the factory, but what you can't do is make or distribute the pigment, so you never see the pigment.
The word oculo refers to the eyes. The word cutaneous refers to the skin. The word oculocutaneous refers to a genetic disorder that affects the eyes and skin, but to varying degrees. As mentioned earlier, the 2 most common forms of albinism are oculocutaneous type 1 albinism and oculocutaneous type 2 albinism.
Oculocutaneous albinism type 1 is sort of the flagship of these diseases, where you have complete absence of the tyrosinase enzyme. And so that enzyme is critical in making melanin. And so if you don't have that enzyme, you can't make pigment. So people who have oculocutaneous albinism usually have really light-colored or red-colored eyes. The hair will be a sort of blonde, white color. The skin will be very pale, almost translucent, where there's no pigment there.
Oculocutaneous type 2 albinism refers to people who have extremely light-skinned eyes and hair, but possess the ability to produce small to moderate amounts of melanin in their bodies, allowing for the skin to tan slightly.
Oculocutaneous albinism type 2, and it tends to have a yellowish color to the hair, as well as the skin. They can have a little bit more of a tan.
The eye color of people with oculocutaneous type 2 albinism can range from various light colors, but oftentimes it's blue. Melanin not only gives the skin its color, it also gives the eyes its color as well, in particular brown. Just as albinism is caused by low amounts of melanin being produced by the body, blue eyes are the result of low amounts of melanin being produced in the iris. Understanding these two types of albinism reveals a clearer picture of the evolution of skin color.
Do people ever mistake you for being a white lady?
Yes, all the time. Well, ones that don't know any better about me, about albinos, they ask me questions, you know, like, are you white? Or is your mother white? And I tell them no, then I explain it to them that I'm albino. And what color is your kids? Like that. Yeah, there's a lot of them that don't understand. And some people do mistake me as a white person. I say, no, I'm not white, I'm an albino. They say, what that mean? I say, I'm black. It just don't show. The color don't show that I'm black, but I'm black. My parents are black, you know, come from black family.
This is where Dr. Diop's assertion of the two types of Africans that he says were in the original population from which all humans come from, but who have different features, comes into the picture. When two extremely dark-skinned people, who Diop refers to as having jet black skin, coarse hair, white noses, and thick lips, produce an offspring with albinism, oftentimes the offspring will look like the person shown here, with extremely light skin, yellow or blondish coarse hair, a white nose, thick lips, and light eyes. But notice the lips, hair texture, and nose size are consistent with what's referred to as black, African American, or African features. But when two extremely dark-skinned people, like the second African described by Dr. Diop, with jet black skin, extremely straight hair, thin noses, and thin lips, produce an offspring with albinism, oftentimes the offspring will look like the person shown here, with extremely light skin, yellow or blondish straight hair, a thin nose, thin lips, and light eyes, which are oftentimes blue. Now let's look at the two side by side and compare them. Notice that both of their offspring have very light skin, yellow or blondish hair color, and light colored eyes. The only differences between their offspring with albinism are the hair texture, nose, and lip size. A person with albinism and a person who is referred to as white share many of the same characteristics. For example, they both have recessive genes. They both are created by people who are carriers of recessive genes. They both produce lower amounts of melanin, which causes their skin to be extremely light. If two people with albinism and two people who are referred to as white conceive a child, the child will have low amounts of melanin, causing the offspring's skin to be light as well. They both are at higher risk of skin cancer if exposed to prolonged periods of sunlight. For example, one of the persons on the screen has albinism and the other one is white. Can you tell which one is which? Let's try it again. One of the persons on the screen has albinism and the other is white. Can you tell which one is which? Let's try it again. One of the persons on the screen has albinism and the other is white. Can you tell which one is which? And again, these small squares represent a sample of skin color. One person has albinism and the other one is white. Can you tell which one is which? Let's try it again. One of the persons on the screen has albinism and the other is white. Can you tell which one is which? The aforementioned observations reinforces that a person with albinism and someone who's considered white share many of the same characteristics. It's the same skin color, light eyes, and yellowish or blondish hair. The only differences are the hair texture, nose, and lip size. Another example, the person on the left has albinism and the person on the right is white. Notice the same skin color and same red hair color. Remember that red hair is caused by the body producing pheomelanin. The only differences are the hair texture, nose, and lip size.
The bust behind me is of Arthur Schopenhauer, a German philosopher who's considered one of the greatest intellectuals of the 19th century. Of the many books that he wrote during his lifetime, one in particular entitled The Metaphysics of the Love of the Sexes contains a detailed and calculated explanation that supports the assertion that the genetic mutation called albinism is the driving force behind the evolution of skin color. And I quote,
I may here express my opinion in passing that the white color of the skin is not natural to man, but that by nature he has a black or brown skin, like our forefathers, the Hindus. That consequently a white man has never originally sprung from the womb of nature, and that thus there is no such thing as a white race. Much as this is talked of, but every white man is a faded or bleached one. He goes on to say, the Gypsies, an Indian race which immigrated only about 4 centuries ago, show the transition from the complexion of the Hindu to our own. End quote.
The word Hindu is a direct reference to the land which is present-day India, not in terms of religion, but in a geographical sense, stemming from the Indus River. Ironically, it's the same place that anthropologist Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop said that the Africans with jet black skin, straight hair, thin noses, and thin lips settled in.
It's the population that looks like this man that Schopenhauer is referring to as the progenitor of people who are classified as white or Caucasian. But through albinism, a lighter skinned version was created. Look at the similarities between the two. Notice the same hair texture, skull similarities, and facial features. The only difference is the color of their skin and eyes, which goes back to the term oculocutaneous. Look at the similarities of this man on the left with extremely dark skin and the lighter skinned man on the right. Again, it's the same extremely straight hair, skull similarities, same nose and lip size. The only difference is the color of their skin and eyes, which goes back to the term oculocutaneous. The same applies to this example. And this example as well. Look at the similarities of the girl on the left with extremely dark skin and the girl on the right with extremely light skin. Once again, it's the same extremely straight hair, skull similarities, same nose and lip size. Once again, the only difference is the color of their skin and eyes, which goes back to the term oculocutaneous. Again, the difference between people with oculocutaneous type 1 albinism and people with oculocutaneous type 2 albinism is that people with type 2 have the ability to tan slightly. For example, look closely at the two people side by side. The person on the right has oculocutaneous type 1 albinism, where the skin is almost white and close to being translucent. The person on the left is slightly darker and would fall under oculocutaneous type 2 albinism. As a result, the evolution of skin color becomes clear.
If you look at, say, a common variant that occurs in Europeans, how long ago did the mutation that created that variation occur? And oftentimes it's over 200,000 years ago. And so when you look at it in that light, well, if the variants in Europeans are so old, then they had to have arisen when that European population was actually in Africa.
Like other founder groups, this small population carrying this particular genetic mutation that caused their skin, hair, and eyes to be light, moved into a new region, which is presently known as Europe, and began to produce offspring. Since the founder group's genes were recessive, and they remain isolated from other populations that look different, they reproduced offspring with recessive genes, causing the population to look similar. Science strongly suggests that this is how the European population originated, and not due to the proximity of living away from the equator. So when the population with dark skin began to mate with the population with albinism, it resulted in the rainbow of skin colors we see today.
The different colors of the world are essentially different combinations of those two. And people who are in between, so people who are not dark and not light, kind of in between, they probably have a combination. And so that's how we get all of our diversity in the world, is from those forms of melanin.
In the past, it was difficult to put together an image of what the first male and female ancestors from which all humans originate from looked like. But through a series of rigorous deductive analysis, we can infer through the diversity of humans today how they looked. Number 1. Skin color. Science emphatically tells us, through the discovery of the oldest fossil remains, that our ancestors lived in Ethiopia along the equator. Ethiopia has an extremely hot climate, which indicates that in order to survive the intense heat, their skin had to be extremely dark pigmented, in particular, jet black. Biology and human genetics concur that two people with light skin, such as the population that migrated to Europe, can't create jet black skin. Biology and human genetics also concur that people who have light brown skin, medium complected, or dark brown skin cannot create people with jet black skin. With this being established through biology and human genetics, we can infer that the original population, from which all humans can be traced back to, had jet black skin. Number 2. Hair texture. When we look at the diversity of humans around the world, we see hair textures ranging from extremely straight to curly to coarse or kinky. We know through science that all humans share a 50-50 mix of genes that were inherited from our parents. With this being established through biology and human genetics, we can infer that the common ancestors from which all humans can be traced back to consisted with people who had coarse or kinky hair and people with extremely straight hair. Number 3. Nose and lip size. For noses, when looking at the human population today, we see nose shapes that range from very wide to extremely thin. For lips, when looking at the human population today, we see lip sizes that range from very thick to thin. With this, we can infer that the common ancestors that all humans can be traced back to had wide noses as well as thin noses, and thick lips as well as thin lips. It's through this process of deduction that gives us a clearer picture of what the first male and female, the mother and father from which all humans can be traced back to look like.
Thanks for watching this documentary. I hope that the information that was shared with you will inspire you to think about an old ideology which can be traced back as far as the 16th century to the Spanish Inquisition in a new way. That's over 5 centuries of being taught that race is valid. This explains why we can look at someone's facial features and hair texture and without hesitation say that that person is black or white or Asian or Hispanic or Indian because we've been trained that way for over 500 years. The purpose of this documentary is to introduce an alternative way to look at race, which is through biology, in particular human genetics. For example, we place people in racial categories simply because they look different. Human genetics explains the biological process which causes us to look different. That's the part that's sorely missing that can offer an alternative to people in how they see the world. It's also sorely needed because the concept of race falsely teaches us that somehow we're different or possess some significant level of uniqueness. Some have even used the concept of race in association with being superior or inferior, which has been scientifically proven to be false. In other words, we're missing the big picture by trying to classify people who look different into man-made categories that don't make sense, instead of educating the masses through human biology of how genes mutate every generation, which causes genetic variance, which ultimately causes us to look different. In addition, how those people who look different moved out of Africa and settled into new regions, which is called a founder group. And those groups reproduce offspring over many generations without mixing with other groups who look different, which is called genetic isolation. Hopefully, after watching this documentary, you'll have a better framework and understanding that it's what's on the inside of our DNA that determines what you see on the outside of us. As mentioned earlier, the word empirical means what can be validated or rejected due to observation or experiment. If you reject the scientific information that was presented in this documentary of how DNA testing has proved that all humans share a common ancestor who lived in Africa around 200,000 years ago, then you also have to reject the same DNA testing that's used to determine paternity tests, as well as DNA testing that's used in our court systems to convict criminals, because it's the same methods being used. Once again, according to the great scholar Fred Kerlinger, there are 4 ways in which people acquire knowledge or learning. Number 1, the method of intuition. Number 2, the method of tenacity. Number 3, the method of authority. And number 4, the method of science. Hopefully, after watching and analyzing the empirical evidence that was presented to you, you've learned through the method of science. And last, I'll end with a quote from Charles Darwin from his book, The Descent of Man in 1871, and I quote, "We are not here concerned with hopes or fears, only with the truth as far as our reason allows us to discover it. I have given the evidence to the best of my ability," end quote. Once again, thanks for watching. Have a great day.